Shalom, this is Mary Omni from the World Government House of King David, Holy Covenant Constitutional Enforcer. This is a Republic Notice. The title of this Republic Notice is called What the Moorish Nation Fails to Understand About Law. What the Moorish Nation Fails to Understand About Law. A couple people have requested what I think of the Moors and wanted to get me to comment on some of the things they've been doing lately and just their whole standing on nationality law, their ways of thinking. And so this video is partly my opinion, and then it's partly truth of God's truth and fact. I'm going to start with God's truth first. God Almighty, first truth and law. God Almighty, first truth and law is the law of one. And that's why his holy covenant has one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Now, you can think this is a coincidence. You can think that this is the white man's, but I'm going to tell you, God is in everything. God Almighty hand is in everything. Don't be fooled by the world. Now, when it comes to the Moorish nation, when we say one nation under God, indivisible, this doesn't match what the Moorish nation is trying to do. They trying to say they are separate from other black Americans, and they have a separate system from other black Americans. In other words, they want to be a specialty black Americans. That has a specialty law outside the majority of black Americans. And if you're not one of them, then you don't come under their specialty law and their specialty protections and their specialty nationality. And this is a failure to understand God Almighty law of one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And this goes back to the treaty that was signed with the Moors in 1787. They wanted a treaty separate from the blacks that they thought they was above, the blacks that was enslaved. They said that they didn't want to be stopped because they was separate and they was Moors and they was, a foreign nation and they was a God sovereign nation, and therefore you hold them other blacks in captivity, but don't put your hands on me because we're protected by, Morocco or Mauritania, and we don't want you to get us mixed up with your Negro slaves because we're Negroes. We don't want you to get us mixed up with them because we're Moors. And it's coming out that some in this Moorish mentality of separatism may have participated in the slave trade and the actual captivity of the holy nation of Judah Israel, which is the one nation, okay? Judah Israel is the one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And it's where the majority of constitutional republic black Americans are. They're Judean and they're Judaic, and they're in a holy covenant as one non-consenting, blameless nation under God Almighty. Now, the Moors in North America, who's calling themselves Moors, when they don't understand the law of one and the law of God, they fail to understand that as a people, we are special, including the Moors. I'm not taking away their specialty. Their specialty, but they're not special outside of other blacks in America, because we have, as black Americans, we have what you call the God particle. That's why we're the God namesake. And with this God particle and God namesake, we span the globe. So to say we just Mauritania or Moors, forget that we have been in several kingdoms all over the earth. So if we would be anything on the earth, it would be called Earthesians or Earthians, if you want to name a place on the earth. But we're interstellar and we're terrestrial because we're God particle, and we're the human part of God particle walking the earth. And therefore, we are one with God Almighty and his nation. So therefore, that's why we have the namesake, and the namesake is the truest form of the God sovereign, not a place or not a country. The namesake of Judah or Yahudah is the true God sovereignty. The true God sovereignty, the true law of God's sovereignty, because you can't get no higher than a namesake. You can name a place like, say, I'm Moors from Mauritania, but that's not higher than being the namesake of God Almighty, because there's no higher law than the scepter of God Almighty and the namesake of God Almighty. And Moors is one of the kingdoms and places that God Almighty has been, because God Almighty namesake would be interstellar and terrestrial. So therefore, they've been from the cosmic to spanning the whole earth. So when you say you Moors from this foreign nation, you want to identify yourself as one separate from black Americans, like Public Mystery Babylon. So what they're doing is imitating Public Mystery Babylon, and they think they can serve two masters. They want to imitate Public Mystery Babylon and say, oh, well, they're treated differently from me. I come under this. Even though they do the right thing in asking judges for jurisdiction. But they don't understand when you use the Constitution, you cannot use it as separate from other black Americans. And in the Constitution, black Americans are Judah, the God sovereign namesake. You know, and we are many things as the God sovereign namesake. We are many things. We are Egyptians, we are Moors, we are Nubians, we are, you know, we are even Roman, we are even Greek. We are everything because we are God namesake. The God particle in us spans everything that has taken place on earth. That is the true law. We are one with everything that has taken place on earth and every empire that has taken place on earth. This is why we are the true law and the scepter after God named Judah or Yehudah. Now, so this is what I want Moors to understand. And that treaty of 1787, they wanted a treaty in spite of seeing blacks in involuntary servitude and mistreated. Now, what they don't know is as long as they was on this land as a foreign nation trying to get a treaty, that treaty conflicts itself, because the fact that consent to involuntary servitude existed at the time of the Moorish treaty. Consent to involuntary servitude. So you got consent and non-consent. You got legal consent to involuntary servitude. So when you sign a paper or a treaty as a foreign nation, what you got was consent to involuntary servitude. So if you was legal then, then you consented to involuntary servitude on this soil. That's all you did, was consented into involuntary servitude. Now, if you say you was foreign and you consented to involuntary servitude, then you wasn't part of this jurisdiction. See, the jurisdiction that made them above just being involuntary servitude was the fact that they was a part of the several colonies or the several nations. And if you wasn't a part of the several 13 colonies or 13 nations, and you signed a treaty consenting to involuntary servitude, what you did was said you consent to your own slavery, because as a foreign nation of Moors, okay? See, it's a little bit more sophisticated than you think, because as a foreign nation from the outside, the United States signed several treaties, but to make sure them treaties meant nothing, it was a contradiction that they signed. The contradiction was they had consent to involuntary servitude. So when they signed all the treaties with these foreign nations like Mauritania or Tripoli, it consented, the nations who signed it with them consented to involuntary servitude, because they wasn't protected by constitutional jurisdiction as a foreign nation. They came as a foreign nation. They was not protected by constitutional jurisdiction like those who were in the Constitution, like the constitutional signers and writers. They was protected by constitutional jurisdiction. They had the jurisdiction of consent to involuntary servitude as the legal jurisdiction. But as a foreign nation, you don't own jurisdiction, so you don't really own the law of it. So what you got was a byproduct of it, and the byproduct of it means that you are a subject. And as a subject, you consented to your own involuntary servitude. And that's the Moorish treaty. See, that's the Moorish treaty in truth. See, they had played the game with themselves because they tried to separate themselves from God Almighty. And if they're basing it on this Moorish treaty, they're saying they are in truth subjects, okay? They are saying they are in truth subjects. See, it's like the race between the tortoise and the hare. They thought they can speed through it faster than the rest of the blacks who systematically had faith, because we are saved by faith and grace. Grace through faith of God Almighty. That's how he protects us, faith through grace. And therefore, to show you how that Moorish stuff was just squashed in truth, when Dred Scott went to the Supreme Court, he wanted to claim his freedom that his former slave captor had given him after he died, and the slave captor wife said, no, I want the legal rights to this slave as my inheritance. And the court then made a decision and said this. It said, there is no law or rights of any black man in this country that we will respect, because he doesn't have legality and legal contracting rights in this country, and he can be arrested whether black, slave, or free. Black, slave, or free. Now, when you say black, slave, or free black, that meant that squashed that Moorish treaty, which was a real subject treaty anyway. That squashed that, which was a real treaty of them being subjects, because they did not own the jurisdiction of law. So they became subjects of the jurisdiction, okay? So you had to be a part of the contract to own the jurisdiction. And the treaty of a foreign nation was not part of that contract. We made treaties with Tripoli, this and that, but you don't understand. God protected America from the beginning through his Judah scepter, which was put in there as involuntarily. So you can't have consent jurisdiction, and